All right. Can everybody hear me? Somebody indicate in the chat box if I'm coming through loud and clear. This is Rodney Jones, and I think I'm going to start this session off. Welcome everyone who might be here for the first time or the second time, or perhaps you've been with us through all three of our presentations. To start off with, we want to talk just a little bit about one of the toughest and most challenging human resource management issues, and that is issues of employee discipline and/or discharge. If you've been with us for the previous couple of webinars, and even if you haven't, if you decide to peruse that material on your own at a future date, most of the material that we've talked about so far, and hand in hand with that, most of the material in our employee management handbook that we are developing, that will be available on the web shortly, has been to encourage performance and productivity by of course treating employees as the most important resource of your farm or ranch business, and we truly believe that. Yet an inevitable fact of life for any manager is that you're going to run into those situations where it's necessary to correct performance, hopefully, or in a worst case scenario, perhaps even terminate employment. So a good, strong understanding of discipline and discharge issues is critical to any employer for two important reasons, of course. Discipline and/or discharge, worst case scenario, are emotionally charged issues, and we all know how good farmers and ranchers are with emotional issues and tough conversations. So point number one, we need to work on that a little bit. And of course, point number two, legal issues can creep up rapidly and cause major problems if these emotionally charged and challenging issues are not handled correctly. So let's talk about discipline first, hopefully being able to correct a problem. Most employee discipline problems are categorized in one of two broad categories. Either the employee committed a violation of rules and policies. It's our policy that you don't drink alcoholic beverages on the job, and yet you did. That's not a good thing, and we need to correct that. Or our policy is that you don't drive over the speed limit in the company vehicle, and yet twice in the last year you've received citations for driving well over the speed limit. We need to do something about that. A violation of rules and policies, and you can think of an endless set of examples that would fall in that category. The second broad category is, of course, unacceptable job performance. The job simply was not done on time or up to the standards that we had set forth in expectations. In either instance, a systematic approach can increase the effectiveness of the discipline or discharge process and keep you out of trouble. So a few suggested steps to follow, a systematic approach, if you will, would be as follows. First, provide a verbal reminder. Next violation, if the behavior hasn't been corrected, provide a written reminder. And if the behavior still persists, provide a decision-making leave day, and then finally terminate employment. And I want to follow up on each of those for just a little bit, one additional slide for each one of those steps. First, provide a verbal reminder. What was the unacceptable behavior or performance? Did you break the rules? Was the job not done correctly? Address specifically what the behavior was that we need to talk about or need to see some change regarding. What are some potential causes of the problem and potential solutions? Have a back and forth discussion of why the problem occurred. and then communicate the specific change that is expected. Here's what I, as the manager, will do to help correct the problem. Here's what you will do. The result is that we need to change. Let's have a discussion about how we can accommodate that change, and then end on a positive note. I'm positive, I'm confident that we can get this problem resolved and move forward. So let's end this first discussion on a positive note with a positive attitude that we can correct the problem. Then a few weeks down the road, the problem persists. The behavior did not change. This is when we really need to make sure that we are documenting everything in writing. We talked about this a few weeks ago. The change has not occurred. Let's get on track here. Let's take another stab at it. Let's give you another chance. Again, I'm confident that we can change this behavior or correct this performance problem. Let's get an agreement from the employee to change the behavior, perhaps a signed document that documents that we are confident that we can get this behavior to change, and then let's move forward. So that's step number 2. And then we move a little further down the timeline, for example, and the violation of the rules happens again, or the job performance just hasn't improved. The behavior still did not change. Then let's get a little more serious. Let's take some time off, not you as the manager, but the employee, paid or unpaid, certainly up to the employer's discretion there. Many would suggest a suspended day with pay. Have a frank discussion with the employee about whether they really want to correct the behavior or whether they will choose to voluntarily leave the organization. And quite often the employee will just simply decide to leave the organization at this point. But certainly it's not out of line to give one more chance to identify precise changes that need to be made, again documenting everything in writing. After we've gone through step 4 and the behavior still has not changed, the rules are still being broken, performance has not improved even though we've provided every opportunity to improve that performance, then it may be time to sever that relationship. As a matter of fact, I would suggest it is probably time to sever that employee-employer relationship. Simply repeat the reasons, the fact that we've given them 3 chances to improve performance or change behavior and still no change. Then just express the obvious reality that this relationship just doesn't seem to be the right fit, and it's time for that employee to pursue other opportunities. Again, don't go it alone at termination time. Select an appropriate time for termination, not in front of other employees, but sometime in private. Again, provide the specific reasons, repeat the performance issue and the fact that we've tried to change 3 different times now. If there are any rights or procedures that are outlined in your employment handbook, be sure and provide a summary of those. And then collect keys and any other company property as appropriate, and make it clear when the employment will be terminated, at the end of the day, immediately. All of that, of course, depends on the specific situation. Shannon, do you have anything to add to that slide? And if not, we'll move on to the next slide, and I believe Shannon's going to take over.
The one thing I would just add to that, and this is kind of going to a different topic that I address a lot in my presentations, but we talk a lot about data security. One thing we talk about, in addition to collecting keys and other company property, is if your employee had any account passwords or access to any of your electronic resources, it's time to change those codes, passwords, and anything else as well. Things like that might also include access to employee cell phones, email accounts, anything like that. That's something we need to make sure that we go ahead and get changed so that we maintain all of our data security measures in place. We talked about discrimination a little bit in the interview process, and in the previous two webinars we've kind of addressed this, and we'll just bring it up here again in the context of separation. And really, there's a lot of importance in the discipline approach that Rod just talked to you about. Number one, first and foremost, we're really trying to give the employee every opportunity to improve, and if they embrace that improvement, fantastic. We've retained a good person, and the operation keeps on going forward. But if we have to let someone go, okay, we at least give them every chance for possible improvement. Now, that's probably the first and foremost reason that we follow those procedures. But the second reason that we do that is to make sure that we carefully document the reasons for an employee separation. We gave them specific notice of what happened. We gave them an opportunity to improve that. We followed up with them about that, and it still didn't happen. The more that we do that and the more carefully we document all of that process and procedure, the better defense that we have should the employee at some point later allege that there was some form of discrimination. Should that be the case, and heaven forbid that it comes to litigation, we can very carefully show, hey, we were really trying to deal with a performance issue here. This wasn't based on discrimination or anything like that. This was purely a performance-based issue. So that's why maintaining that documentation, but also, very importantly, being consistent in how you apply discipline and discharge procedures, that matters. Because if we're being inconsistent in how we handle employees, we're basically setting ourselves up for a potential discrimination claim down the road. So make sure that in every instance of discipline or termination that you have with your employees, treat them all consistently and fairly. That's good for the business and just good for you personally from a litigation standpoint as well. Just again, really briefly, we're talking about hiring and firing and discrimination, but any sort of different treatment mentioned with respect to an employee, that has the potential to be grounds for discrimination. That's following the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which generally applies if you have 15 or more employees. But most states have discrimination statutes that apply to someone with any number of employees whatsoever. And usually that includes things like sexual harassment, discrimination based on any gender or medical traits, discrimination based on any race or ethnic traits, national origin, age, et cetera, et cetera. And remember, discrimination isn't just hiring and firing like we talked about. It can also mean differentiation in promotion, assignments, compensation, hiring, firing, any sort of disparate treatment that's based on a protected trait. That's something you have to watch out for. So with that, let's say we've actually kept an employee through an entire successful career. Now, let's talk about ways that we can provide some incentives to those employees, and that harkens back to what we were talking about last week. But let's talk about some potential tax advantages, both to the employer and to the employee, for some retirement issues. And for that, we're going to turn it over to our resident tax expert, Mr. J.C. Hobbs.
Thanks, Shannon. What we're going to hit upon here are some of the really simple and basic plans that are really common and beneficial to agriculture. Plans like profit sharing, those don't work so well in ag because a lot of times we don't have profits. So what we're going to hit upon here are things that work well in ag that apply to both the employer and the employee in most cases. We're going to talk about some of the options, how you look at those. They need to be evaluated because some are simple, some are very complex. Rules must be followed to avoid penalties, other problems, and no matter what you do, it is extremely important to discuss options with a retirement advisor before you implement these, because one plan is often better than another. And even though you say one is more simple or one is more complex, I don't want to use those, there's some definite benefits to evaluating those. Let's start off with what we call a Simplified Employee Pension Plan, or SEP. It's basically an IRA type program, an individual retirement account. So that's why they call them a SEP IRA. It's simple. Its contributions limit is a little better than some. You can contribute up to 25% of your net income. So as a farm operator, if you're looking at this thing as the owner-operator, 25% of your net income up to a maximum of $53,000 for 2016. As the employee, you can determine, or the employer can determine what that contribution is or how much it will be. All the contributions are sheltered from taxes. These contributions on an annual basis can be adjusted, which makes it nice. Years of good profit, we can increase the amount. Years of low profits or no profits, we can change those to lower levels. Also, if you look at the administration of these things, a SEP IRA is very easy to set it up, establish, very easy to administer as a farm operator. So it's a simple, very easy little program. It works well. It gives your employees a chance to increase their retirement benefits, and gives you the employer also the same opportunity by allowing them to get involved in a SEP IRA as well. Another plan that we can apply is the Simple IRA. And then what basically the Simple comes from, it's a savings incentive match plan for the employees. The way it works is the employer and the employee both match contributions up to 3% of pay. So both sides, both parties contribute. Makes it a little more complex than the SEP, but it gives us a little opportunity for both parties to be involved. The contributions limit is a little lower. Remember the last one was up to $53,000. Well, now the contribution is $12,500 a year, or if you're over or 50 or over, that jumps up to $15,500. So not quite as large of an annual contribution, but it still, by matching, gives us an opportunity for growth. It's neat because it's also easy to administer and establish this plan as well. And a nice thing over the SEP, as you add new employees to the plan, a Simple IRA is very easy to add new employees. A SEP IRA is a little more complex, a little more complicated, but it can be done. If you're wanting a little larger contribution than the Simple, there's a 401k. Now the 401k is rather unique for the agriculture point of view. It's not like one where you're in a corporate business. It's a little, somewhat a little more complex from that point of view. The employee can contribute up to $18,000, $24,000 if age 50 or older. The employer can contribute also up to 25% of compensation to a maximum of $53,000. So it kind of goes back to the SEP IRA in a lot of regards. So again, it gives us opportunities for greater growth, greater enhancements. One of the things that occurs here, the annual contributions can be adjusted, just like the SEP, and we can borrow against it. The other two you cannot. So if you've got money in a 401k and you need some extra dollars, you can borrow against the 401k. Has to be repaid, but it gives us an opportunity to use those retirement dollars in current times, but by repaying them, then we get to recapture those benefits at retirement date. So the 401k gives us some opportunities that the Simple doesn't. It gives us the growth that the SEP does. So again, when we said simple to complex, know the rules, here's what we're getting at. Know what you're looking for, know what they offer, and evaluate accordingly. Now, we also have the ability to use traditional IRAs. One of the drawbacks here is the employer really can't do much other than stress to the employee that you should look at this, because the employer cannot enforce a employee to start an IRA. The employer has the opportunity here to also get involved in his own. The rule states you must have taxable compensation. What does that mean? You have to have wages, earnings, etc. So you have to have active business operations from the wage standpoint to get or be able to contribute to this. Interest income, those types of items do not help. The contributions are tax deductible if we qualify. In other words, what this means, the qualifications are if you're a high income earner, you may be limited on how much you can contribute and take a tax deduction for it. Most of the time, I'd say our average farmer will never get into this. Limit, well, $5,500 per year is the annual contribution limit, $6,500 if you're equal to or above age 50. Now, one of the things with the traditional IRA, you have to start taking distributions by the time you're 70 and a half. You can start as early as 59.5, but you have to start withdrawing it at 70.5. If you fail to, there is a tax and penalty that goes with that. Deductible contributions and earnings are taxable when you start withdrawing those. Early withdrawal, be very careful. These can result in a tax and penalty. Now, there are certain times when you can withdraw this before age 59.5. It's not advisable. The last IRA that we look at is going to be the Roth IRA. Again, like the traditional, you've got to have taxable compensation or wages or earnings. But here, the contributions are not tax deductible. So if you contribute to a traditional, you get to take that as a tax write-off. It reduces your taxable income. A Roth IRA contribution has no impact on the income tax liability at the end of the year. Limit $5,500 again, just like the traditional, $6,500 age 50 or above. Now here's the neat part. This is what sets a traditional versus a Roth apart. The original owner does not have to take distributions from a Roth IRA. It can lay there and forever. No requirement that you start at 70.5. The contributions and earnings are not taxable with withdrawn. It avoids income tax and estate tax. Another enhancement of the Roth IRA. But if you take an earlier withdrawal, just like the traditional, it can result in a tax penalty or tax and penalty. So when you start looking at these things, you really want to look at very closely what are your goals for your retirement plans for your employees, what kind of compensation do you want to allow, what different types of, or what type of retirement program best fits your needs and the employee's needs. 1, makes them happy. 2, get some retirement contributions, retirement program benefits for later, and it's just some better employee relations. With that, Shannon, since the ACA slides didn't get in, do you want me to talk about that for just a second?
Yeah, and I apologize. I think it must have been a slide error on that part. I apologize, audience. We'll actually include the ACA discussion in the handbook itself. But yeah, if you wouldn't mind, JC, go ahead and talk a little bit about how the Affordable Care Act can or will sometimes won't apply to agricultural employers.
I can do that. Now, we apologize for these slides not being there. I'm assuming Shannon will get those and put them right after the retirement slides. But what we're going to talk about is the Cliff Notes version of the Cliff Notes for the Affordable Care Act. These are going to be very simple discussion. What the Affordable Care Act really did when it came about, there was some market reforms that occurred, those being we eliminated lifetime limits and annual limits on health benefit payments. So if you were in the hospital with a cancer treatments and you got to a certain amount, under the old rules, you could be termed out of your program. You lose your life insurance or your health insurance. Under the new program, those lifetime limits are gone. There's no cost sharing of preventative health services. It limited the 90-day, or limits to a maximum of 90 days the waiting period for insurance. It used to be longer than that, or could be. Now it's 90 days or less. Also, dependent care coverage is now extended until age 26 for your dependents. It used to be that it was much lower than that. So it allowed, for example, if you had a student in college that was allowed to 24, if your child decided to quit and leave home and go to work, then it could terminate as early as 18. So, Affordable Care Act made that consistent, made it up to age 26. So these people can be covered while they're in school. There is also, every policy has to have a summary and benefits coverage that is in simple, understandable terms. If all of these points are covered, then we can avoid the excise tax back to the employee or employer for compensation issues. So there's no, if it meets all of these, then we avoid excise tax or penalties. Now, under the employer mandate, it finally has kicked in 2015. What that is, it's a large employer. That is basically an employer with 50 or more full-time employees during 2015 than the rules would apply to 2016. So you look at the past year to see what applies for the current year. The rules say we have to provide minimal essential coverage to all employees and their dependents, or provide employer shared responsibility payments to the IRS. Those are the ESRP, and you'll understand that more when you see the slides. One thing about it, if you are an employer and you have 50 or more employees, you need to be talking to your accountant, your tax preparer. You want to make sure you comply with the rules in order to make sure that we avoid any potential penalties, because these are severe and getting worse. Now let's talk about the employer obligations for the small employer. That's less than 50 employees during 2015. We're not responsible, or the employer is not subject to the employer shared responsibility payment for those individuals that aren't covered. Small employers aren't required to require or offer health insurance to those employees because of their size. However, all employees under their supervision must meet the individual mandate. In other words, they are supposed to carry their own insurance. Questions frequently come up. Well, I'm an owner of a business. Can I provide money for employees to buy insurance or reimburse them? No, you don't want to do that. That creates a situation where you can face the penalty. Basically, you are discriminating. You've got to look at, well, if I increase their wages, you increase everybody's and hope that they use those extra dollars to buy insurance. If we look at a little further, the individual mandate, it applies to individuals as well as self-employed individuals. So if you're operating a farm, you have no employees, you're self-employed, you have to meet the individual mandates. You have to have or health insurance. If you do not have that, or you do not meet the requirements for being exempt from coverage, you must make an individual shared responsibility payment to the IRS. Otherwise, you face another penalty. So what is minimal essential coverage in that? Well, it's an employer-sponsored group plan, a state market plan, government plan, or something that's grandfathered or which is approved by the Department of Human Services. Now that's where it comes back to. If you fit one of those, you need to be looking with your tax preparer. They're really the only ones that have, well, in my opinion, a good understanding, other than the insurance people, of what's going on here. This thing is being monitored by accountants. They're your best friend when it comes to looking at, do you meet the requirements? Also, make sure that your preparer is kept informed of changes in your family or business operations. So if you add children, if we change our business a little bit, we go from a different type of a entity, make sure they understand that, because non-compliance will result, and can and often result, in extremely high or large penalties, and you really can avoid those by just simply talking to your tax advisor, finding out what is covered, what is not, and what you have to have in order to meet those requirements, either under the large employer, the small employer, or the individual mandates. That pretty much covers those pieces. Again, apologize for them not being in the slide set. We'll make those available. But that's the gist, the simplified gist of what's going on with the Affordable Care Act as it applies to your farm business. All done, Shannon.
All right, JC, thank you very much for that. And again, if you guys have questions, we'll have time at the end for some Q&A, because I know sometimes that can be a little bit confusing. So make sure you type those into the chat box when we get towards the end of the presentation. Right now, we're going to turn things over to Tiffany Dow-Lashschmidt with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. Tiffany's done a lot of great work on dealing with the covert video problem that we've seen kind of arise in agriculture of late. So we'll turn things over to Tiffany. Oh, Tiffany, are you there? You might still have your microphone on mute, Tiffany, if you are still there.
Shannon, can you hear me?
There we go. You're there.
I am here. I am not having a baby, so we're good on that front.
Just wanted to check.
I Yeah, I warned Shannon yesterday. I am about 9 months pregnant, and so I told him I'd be happy to speak today with the caveat that if I went into labor, someone would have to fill in. But either fortunately or unfortunately, I'm still here, so I'll be the one doing the speaking today. So we want to talk a little bit about covert videos, and this is an issue that we've seen a lot in the ag industry in lots of different areas over the last several years. It's something that a lot of times we think, oh, that's just, something that big producers face, or that's only something that the huge dairies or huge feedlots have to deal with. And that's just not the truth. In the last several years, we've seen several instances of undercover video type situations occurring on small operations. There was one in Colorado. It was a family operation. They had 2 employees outside of the family, and so this can happen kind of to anybody, and so it's a really good idea to be aware of the issue and kind of be prepared. And so we're going to go through these slides. I like to start out and just say, what's the best advice? Well, the best advice is to prevent an undercover video from occurring in the first place, but you want to prepare as though it'll happen. And so that's one of those things. It's just important to be aware of. And, obviously, none of us in the ag industry want to have situations where we're dealing with animal abuse. We want to make sure, I know that Rod and Shannon have talked before about making sure we've got adequate training for employees. We've got ongoing training happening, things like that. We want to make sure that we don't have employees abusing animals, period. And if we do have those issues, we sure want to be the ones who deal with them. And so I think that's important. But the next thing is you need to prepare as though an undercover video could happen and have some things in place in that instance. And so let's talk first here about hiring practices. And I know that this was something covered extensively by Shannon and Rod in the first webinar. They did a great job. But here's a few thoughts on this, sort of from the covert video angle. The first thing you want to do always is talk about your hiring procedures with an attorney. It's just a good idea to run those by an employment lawyer, make sure everything looks good. There's not any possibility that there could be claims of discrimination. And another point that I know Shannon made multiple times in that first webinar, we want to be consistent when we're dealing with hiring practices so that we don't discriminate against protected classes. We'll talk about this in a minute. For example, you don't want to treat one race different than another race. You want to be consistent with everybody. And so if you're going to ask questions about things like affiliations with undercover video groups, or if you're going to ask questions about things like that, you need to make sure you're asking everybody those questions. So consistency is really key there. One point that can be helpful in these situations is when you have job applicants fill out an application, if you've got an application they're going to fill out, have them swear to the truth of that application under the penalty of perjury. That seems a little bit excessive, might seem crazy, but I'll tell you what this does. If they lie on their application, if they did so under penalty of perjury, now there may be an option for them to face criminal perjury charges for providing untruthful information. And so when we're dealing with covert videos, a lot of times this is what we're seeing. It's pretty rare nowadays for somebody to actually sneak onto a farm and record. What we see much more of is that they provide false information in their application process. They get themselves hired on as an employee of the operation, and then they record the video. And so, like I say, one way to give yourself another option potentially of punishing these people for providing false information on those employment applications is to have them swear under the penalty of perjury. One question you can ask in your employment application or in interviews is, do they have any affiliations with animal rights groups? Absolutely. I think that's a great question to ask. And again, have them swear to that under penalty of perjury. Also ask for prior names or aliases. Obviously a lot of these folks aren't going to give you those. If they do, great. They probably won't. But it's on there at least. Checking references. This one's really important, and this is a lesson that a lot of the folks who've dealt with covert video investigations have mentioned to me. You know, they'll have an application come in and it lists 3 references, and they say, well, I called the references and they were all great. You know, I can't believe that this happened. Well, what it turned out the person had done is they listed references with false names and job titles. And so, you know, maybe they list their buddy with PETA as a reference, and so he gives a glowing review. And so that's problematic. So one thing you can do is Google the name of the company the reference supposedly works for and check the phone number. You know, if they say they work for ABC Farms, look up ABC Farms and make sure the phone numbers match. It's a simple thing that can be done that may really help avoid an issue later. Here's another simple thing, but several of the folks who I've spoken with said, oh my gosh, if we would have just done this, we could have avoided this entire situation. Google the employee's name, see what comes up. You'll be shocked at how many of these folks, if you've got the right name, if they didn't use a false name, it's amazing how many of them are going to come up on, you know, various websites making comments or commenting on blog posts or things like that. So take the time to just Google their name. Also on that same front, check their social media pages. People are always posting stuff that they don't think about on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. Just do a quick check, run through those. When I was in private practice, we had a paralegal, and every case that came through the door, the first thing she did was get on Facebook. And you would be amazed at what she could find. Another thing that's important to think about is having a professional background check run through an organization that conducts those. It's a good idea to use the pros on something like that, and I realize that's an added cost up front. But you know, they know what they're doing. They do a good job. They're going to make sure to abide by the law on those background checks. Here's a list we put together of some warning signs of potential undercover videographers on a farm. If there's somebody who's seeking employment drastically below their skill level, you know, so for example, if you've got somebody who applies for a job and, you know, they've got a master's degree or a PhD, you know, but they're coming in and they're wanting to muck stalls, that might be set off a red flag for you. So especially if they're wanting to have access to the animals, keep that in mind. If their previous jobs are sort of out of character with the job they're applying for, that can be another warning sign. A lot of times they'll volunteer to do work for no pay, or they'll volunteer to come early or stay late. So keep an eye on that. Also watch if you've got applicants with out of state or newly obtained driver's licenses. Certainly, you know, that there could be other explanations for this, but that's something we see a lot with these activists. So keep an eye on that. They're usually young, between ages 18 and 30, and a lot of times they'll seek short-term work. So if you've got kind of a seasonal type operation or a seasonal job opening, they may be looking for something like that. A lot of times these folks are going to ask questions about security on the farm or time schedules. They'll be very curious about when people work and when bosses are there and things like that. I already mentioned this, but they'll volunteer for jobs before or after normal business hours. They arrive early and stay late, and they don't mind the less desirable jobs that let them have contact with animals. One other thing we'll see a lot of is mingling with upper management, kind of trying to get in with them. That's another potential warning sign. And so also keep an eye out, you know, if people are places where their job doesn't take them, if it doesn't make sense that they're in the milking barn or whatever, that could be a sign too. So that's something else to sort of keep an eye on. And so what do we do? So we want to prevent hiring these employees to start with, right? But what can we do for employees that we already have, or whether they be legitimate employees or these undercover folks? One thing is to have a good employee handbook and a contract. And again, I keep preaching this, but this is a good thing to talk with an attorney about. Make sure that the attorney's reviewed it. And this is real important, especially if you're in an at-will employment state. In some situations, handbooks or contracts, there could be language in there that might change that at-will relationship to a contractual one where you've got to take certain steps and you have to fire for cause. And so make sure that that's something you run by your attorney. When you have these handbooks, we want to have terms in here, particularly about animal handling. This is kind of the biggest issue, but we want to have, very clear, this is what's appropriate, this is what's not. We talked earlier in the webinars about having disciplinary procedures set out. All that needs to be in the handbook, and it's a good idea to have all of your employees review the handbook and sign an acknowledgement that they have seen and understood those written practices. One thing that you might think about doing is providing that all cell phones and cameras have to be left in vehicles or in their lockers, just to keep recording devices out of the area where the animals are. So that's something to think about as well. Or you could provide that cameras can only be used with written permission from the farm owner. Another thing you can do here, and this is sort of to try and give you some more rights on the back end of things, is provide that any unauthorized photos or video that are taken are the property of, this says the dairy, I usually do these to dairy groups, but they're the property of the farm. And so if those photos or videos are your property and someone goes about distributing them, you potentially have some good property right arguments that may be able to help you in that situation. This is probably the most important thing on this point. You need to have a policy that, so all of your employees know, any animal abuse needs to be immediately reported to the supervisor or to the farm owner. This is important for a couple of reasons. Number one, if you've got employees there who are seeing things going on, who maybe are seeing folks there causing trouble, causing animal abuse, to record it, that needs to be reported to you right away so you can handle it. If you've got an employee who's not an undercover activist but abusing animals, you want that reported immediately. So that's an important thing to have. Employee training, obviously it's important to train your employees on the practices you've developed for animal care and handling. A big one is dealing with downed animals and euthanasia procedures. You want to make sure everybody is trained on that. I recommend ongoing training, more than just the 2-minute spiel they might get on the day they start their job. This is a big one. Make sure if you've got policies and procedures in place, the employees have the tools and equipment to follow those policies. There was a story about a dairy where some video was shot of them dragging the cow. The dairy policy is that all down cows had to be moved on sleds. But when when the investigation kind of got underway, it turned out the dairy didn't have any sleds. And so that looks pretty problematic, so that's something to be very careful about. Make sure you've got long-term employees on the lookout for anything suspicious, whether that be somebody recording things, anybody abusing animals, anything like that. Those guys on the ground are your best eyes in those situations. And then I also recommend conducting your own undercover investigation just to make sure that these practices are being followed, even when the boss might not be there. And so our last point here, what if the worst does occur? What if the undercover video does break, it goes out into the press? What do you need to do? You want to have a crisis team put together now so that you know who to call when things go bad. And this, this is important regardless of if we're dealing with the undercover video, if there's a food safety outbreak, if there's a blizzard, if there's some sort of issue like that. A crisis team in place is a real good idea. These need to include attorneys, veterinarians, potentially a media firm with someone with media training. Another thing, you want to have things like phone numbers in a notebook, for like the power company, for the just things like that you might not think of. If something goes bad, you need to have this team and this information already in place. As part of that, you want to identify who's going to be involved and make sure everybody's assignments are clear. And you want to appoint one spokesman, ideally somebody with media training. And the ag industry, the dairy industry especially, offers a lot of these media trainings. They're very helpful. If you can send somebody or hire somebody who's had these trainings, that can be very useful. On the flip side, it's real good to remind employees who have not had media training, they might need to keep their mouth shut. The last thing you want is, a bunch of your employees out there on Twitter or on the evening news, yapping it up and causing you more trouble, even if they're trying to help. So that's something important to keep in mind. I think that wraps up what I've got. One more thing here. I thought I had one more slide, and it didn't click to it. One more thing, I want to just touch on a couple of points here. Again, I talked to folks who've been through this. Here was the advice they gave me. The big thing that they said they did is they had some goodwill built up in their community before this type of thing happened. The best example of that I've seen is with the Bluebell ice cream situation here in Texas. Bluebell had a listeria outbreak. They had to recall a bunch of ice cream. They were shut down for a long time. But that company had so much goodwill and support in the community that they really had that in place before they had trouble. The next thing people said is about that hiring a media firm or having spokesmen with media training. You really can't emphasize the importance of that enough. Pay the money up front to have background checks run on your new hires. That's another one. I know it's an added expense up front, but it will save you a lot of money in the end if you could prevent hiring somebody undercover. And make sure you write down your procedures and best practices. Having those sort of things documented is always important. All right, and I'm going to turn it back over to Shannon.
Tiffany, thank you very much for that. And I think, audience, if you've picked up a theme throughout all these webinars, it's been something that one of my friends talks about a lot in his farm business consulting works, and that is policy before the need. Like Tiffany just said, working on this from a remedial approach, that's you kind of trying to get yourself caught back up when you're already behind. Having a policy in place before the situation arises so that you prevent the negative situation from even occurring in the first place, that's the way to go about it. So, like we've talked about with your employment policies and procedures, if you're an animal livestock operation, let's have some good husbandry procedures in place. Have a strong culture and support of that. Be consistent in your support of that. And make sure that you have an obligation that if your employees see anything happening, that they report it immediately so that we fix the problem and there's really nothing to report there at all. And that kind of feeds into the thing that we're going to talk about to sort of wrap things up with our webinar series is about employer reputation. Tiffany was just talking about, for example, the Bluebell Company and the amount of goodwill that they had built up in the community. And that's the same kind of thing that we want to be striving for as an agricultural employer. When we need to have good people, we want good people to already know that our farm is the place where they want to work. We've got a reputation for being cutting edge in our practices. We have a reputation of being, very supportive of our families that work for us. And we're basically given a reputation that we support with our on-farm culture of being the place that people want to work, not just, seasonally, but for the long term as well. When you're designing the jobs for your agricultural operation, try to do that with the employees that are going to fulfill those jobs in mind as you create that description. See where their personal interests are and try to connect them. I think you all know that if you've had a job where you felt passionate about what you were trying to do and you felt that it matched well with your skill set, you were energized by that work. So try to match the things that need to happen on the farm with the people that want to do that sort of thing. You'll be surprised the kind of performance potential you can unleash in your employees when you really have them connected with something about which they have a deep passion and that connects really well with the skills that they're good at. Farm work is hard. I don't think that's news to anybody that's on this webinar here, but let's try to deal with that a little bit. We know that there are certain times of the year, for example, right now, depending on which part of the U.S. you're in, you're either trying to put winter wheat in the ground and so you're working 24 hours a day, or you're trying to get your fall harvest crops out of the field and you're working 24 hours a day on that as well. And some of that can't be avoided. But to the extent that we can, using, again, reasonable policies, having some vision in planning our human resource needs, and trying to have enough human resources on the farm, let's try to keep work hours reasonable each day and each week so that we're not wearing our people out. Let's try to keep our equipment in good repair so we're not constantly spending time in downtime with equipment. Let's make sure our people are equipped to do things well by making sure they actually have the proper training and that we set them up for success, that we don't set them up for failure. Try to have at least some flexibility in scheduling work hours because sometimes life happens and that's okay, so let's try to be as accommodating as we can. And let's keep that constant feedback going. Like Rod talked about during our second webinar, people want to know how they're doing. If they're doing well, they need to hear that. If they're not doing well, most times employees want to know what they can do better so that they can do a good job. Very few people want to go in and just do a job and not do it well. I think most people really do want to do a good job, so let's equip them to do that by actually communicating frequently and meaningfully with our supervisors and employees. Try to figure out what motivates your employees. Let them try to have some variety. We all get kind of bored doing the same thing over and over, so let's give them the opportunity to do different things that require different skill sets or just to mix things up a little bit. If we have the opportunity to let employees see a project through from start to finish, that may be calf raising like we have here on the slide. That may be supervising a crop from sowing to harvest. That gives people a sense of, accomplishment and completion, and that can be really valuable for them as well. Make sure you communicate to your employees how important what they do is. Every job on the farm matters, and we see that a lot in farm transition work. One of the biggest barriers that we often encounter with families is that a family member doesn't feel appreciated when they're making contributions that may not be upfront, but they're very important. I mean, if you think about the farm, the production activities often get a lot of the credit. We might brag about our yields or our returns, but how often do we think the people that are making our meals or maintaining the farm homestead or something like that? So let's make sure we show appreciation to everyone. That's really important to their validation and their sense of meaning and belonging on the farm. Make sure your employees have some level of responsibility and let them be creative. You know what, this is especially true with our young farm workers, the millennial generation. People in the millennial generation, by and large, want to be creative. They don't see the world in boxes. They've always had a collective or systematic view of the world, a very connected view. And so sometimes what you need to do is don't tell them how to solve a problem, just tell them what the problem is and let them find a solution. Oftentimes you'll be pretty impressed with the creativity they demonstrate. So give them that responsibility, that authority, and that freedom. And then again, make sure that you're constantly providing feedback to those employees out there. Kind of wrapping everything up, we've talked about showing appreciation to your employees, having good, clear job descriptions so people know what is and isn't their job, so we don't have to worry about mission creep or having people doing redundant work or looking over each other's shoulder. Make sure you equip them for success with training, show them that you trust them, and when people are doing things well, make sure you bring that to their attention as well. Make sure that they have a sense of pride both in themselves and the operation. If we have good things happen, let's celebrate that. Make sure that we make fair compensation an important priority in our business, and sometimes I know that commodity prices or other economic realities make that tough, but to the extent we can, let's invest in our people, and I think you'll see real rewards from that. If there's informal benefits we can provide, like we talked about, child care, use of a vehicle, or some other sort of in-kind advantage we can give to our employees, let's do that. Try to provide upward mobility, and we know that most farms have a pretty flat hierarchical structure, but to the chance that you can give someone the opportunity to advance to higher levels of responsibility or authority, that's a really important intrinsic benefit that you can provide. Try to make the business family friendly. One of the biggest things that we see in American employment that's an issue is accommodating folks with families. So to the extent that we have a really good family environment on the farm, let's try to figure out ways to leverage that advantage to attract the best people to work there. And always show your pride in advancing employees and moving them up the ranks there. Last thing, before we get things closed and talk about some questions, I want to talk very briefly about having families, members as employees. Oftentimes we hire family members because they're around and, we feel like they already have some sort of tie to the farm, so by gosh, they're obligated to work there. But let's, like we talked about in our first webinar, do a employee needs assessment and figure out where the family members that we have and their skills fit in our needs on the farm. And let's also take a look at that in light of our transition plan. If we intend that our kids or our nephews, nieces, cousins, whatever the case might be, will someday have a larger role in the farm. How do we set up an employment experience for them that will prepare them for the role that they're eventually supposed to face? So things to think about with that is, number one, look at the person's skill set and see where that ties in on the farm. If there's something that they could be doing that they're not doing, and that other position is a better fit for them, let's talk about how we can migrate them over to that position that's a better fit for their skills and their interests. We need to ask ourselves, if we're going to hire someone who's a family member, are they willing to accept our authority structure? Will they take instruction, or are they going to kind of blow it off because it's mom and dad? Will they accept feedback? Will they respond politely and professionally to a family member supervising them? How are we going to compensate them? And compensation for a family member might look different, especially if we're tying this employment relationship to their eventual transition to a position of authority on the farm. That may mean that they may not be making quite as much salary, but they may be getting an equity stake in the operation, and that might be part of their compensation package. You know, that's good, but that's also an important thing to run by our attorney and our tax professional as part of both our transition plan and our compensation and benefits plan, like JC was talking about earlier. Do we have requirements for educational attainment? If you want to come back and work on the farm, do you need to have a bachelor's degree in an agricultural or business-related field so that you can actually make a positive additional contribution to our human capital? And in some farm cases, there's a requirement that you have to go work for someone else. You know, number one, have the experience of working for someone who's not a family member to learn how to respond to authority when that person's not a parent or grandparent or uncle or aunt. Maybe you need to learn how different farms do things so you can bring back some fresh ideas. Maybe if you want to be really cynical about it, maybe you could make some mistakes on someone else's farm so you don't make those mistakes on our farms. You know, there are lots of reasons there. But these are all things that you can consider when you have a family employment policy. But the important thing to remember about all family employment policies is that you need to have a policy. That's because if we want to see everyone treated fairly, we need to have a policy that, again, we consistently enforce so that everyone does see that there's transparency and fairness for everyone involved. You know, we've been talking for the past 3 weeks about these employment policies and issues. Just remember, you may think that this is a bunch of policy stuff and you're just talking about a bunch more bureaucracy that we don't have time for on our farm, Farrell. But what we're really talking about here is something you can't afford to ignore. Your human resource is the most important resource that you have on your farm. Take that seriously. If you give it first priority, it's going to yield benefits for your farm, guaranteed. That's to say nothing about the fact that in today's legal environment, you'd have to make HR a priority as well. So pay attention to that, pay attention to your important resource, and make sure that you're consistent in the application of your policies. That's good for you, it's good for your employees, it's good for everyone.